So we're going to get started tonight with a reading from this book so you can get a sense of the atmosphere of it, and then we will dive straight into its troubled waters.
Thanks, Emily, and thank you everybody for braving this really rainy night. Is this working? Yeah, it seems to be. So I'm just going to read a couple of pages from the prelude of the book. A large pool of water had appeared overnight on our kitchen floor. So silent and unexpected, it seemed to be a mirage. Tap water had been dribbling from a loose pipe beneath the sink and leaking noiselessly down through the 2 stories below us. This scene, which we woke up to on the morning of our son's 9th birthday, was the most dramatic but not the only incident of water damage. For several months before and after, a collection of plastic buckets and basins had become a semi-permanent wandering feature, brought out to catch leaks in different parts of our home. One evening, a few months after the kitchen flood, our elder son noticed water dripping from the plasterwork rosette in the center of the living room ceiling. Looking up, we saw an ominous spreading patch of brown as water leaking from upstairs traversed the terrain above our heads. Water always finds its way. My sons and I fetched the buckets and basins once more and laid out towels to soak it up. It was as if our new apartment was trying to tell us something. The apartment we had lived in before on the east side of the city, with an Edenic plasterwork of vines, fruits, and flowers twisting around the columns of its facade, exerted no such influence. We were there for 10 years, husband and wife, 2 sons, 2 cats, and throughout this time, regardless of our difficulties, that apartment was consistently neutral. It did not make its presence felt or stir up any overt feelings. It was simply a container, benevolent if anything, in enabling the maintenance of the status quo. Our new apartment, closer to the boys' school in the west, was awkward from day one. Aggravating and interfering, it kept producing warning signals that could not be ignored. It intervened and forced itself into the role of the protagonist. There are things you can see and others that you can only feel, that you sense in a different way, as a whisper in your mind or a weight in your bones. A nugget of doubt had crystallized and been disturbing the everyday flow of my thoughts for weeks already. Like a silty clot of debris, its vague contours had gained definition when we moved east to west across the axis of the city. Its shape was of unhappiness, and now here it was, clotting up my mind as I paced between the many rooms of our extravagantly proportioned new home. A cultivated emptiness in the mind can allow for rippling, drift, and snag. It can draw out things that don't want to be seen. That early morning encounter with a glassy pool of water on the kitchen floor was an unequivocal sign of rupture. Something had broken its banks and could no longer be contained. After years of emotional repression, subconsciously practiced to maintain a functional family life, this spontaneous display, this uncalled for outburst, this flood, was a symbol of almost hysterical clarity. It asked for an equally extreme response, which duly came in a sudden, brutal, and final break. A severing of the family unit, whereby one part was broken off and the other 3 parts remained together. My husband went away for work and never came back to our home.
It's such an excellent beginning to a book. Something I'm so struck by in this prelude is when you speak about your old apartment and you say that it operated as a sort of neutral space, whereas what one discovers as you read this book is that actually no space is neutral, that the notion of neutrality is kind of antithetical to the inhabitation of space. And as you're interrogating different levels of space in this book, from the domestic to the urban, the shared, the collective, the core of it is this apartment. So tell us about the apartment itself, the personal level of the story, and what brought you to write a personal story from the perspective of a home.
Well, I think that there is an assumed neutrality until, for whatever reason, you start to focus on something and you start to see it. And that's what happened in this situation, because of this intersection of facts, that we had moved to this new apartment, that it was in a different part of the city, and that my relationship was collapsing. So I was just looking at things in a different way, as you do in those moments of crisis. And and through this, realized that I was searching for some kind of orientation, and became, in some way, kind of fixated on this apartment, as the kind of, as if it had been the catalyst for this break, which it wasn't. It was just circumstantial, but that's how it appeared in that very kind of heightened emotional moment. And and as I became kind of absorbed in this place, I started thinking about where it actually was, and the difference in Berlin of moving from an apartment in the east to moving to one in the west is great, obviously. And I hadn't really anticipated that actually before I moved. And this new apartment that we moved into was only just in the west, on the borders of this body of water, the Landwehr Canal, but looking directly east, like looking right into the heart of the city. So you could see this kind of patchwork of different kinds of architecture from different periods, different historical periods, kind of rolling out like a carpet to the horizon. And the more I looked at this, view and thought about it, particularly the view that was framed by my kitchen window, well, it just became this problem that needed to be solved. It just presented itself as material, as a subject matter in a way.
It's so interesting. There's some architectural theorist who I can't remember, but he talks about how built space is meant to be transparent, and when it loses its transparency, that's when it stopped working. So the fact of its visibility means that it ceased to perform its function, and that seemed to be what's happening with your apartment.
That's exactly what was happening. Yes, exactly.
And it's so interesting. So we have the personal space, the intimate space, the domestic space, but this is also, as the subtitle suggests, a story of Berlin. And so we're operating on these two opposite poles. On the one end, we have everything that's private, everything that's contained, that's within the family. On the other end, we have public space that is received from the state, from history, space that has difficult channels of navigation, that has a relationship to power that's very different from the home. So what I think is so compelling about this work is that your own very personal story brings you to this larger story of Berlin. Can you tell us about how you charted out that path from personal inquiry into this vast inquiry as to the history, the heart of Berlin itself?
Well, it also had very much to do with this search for orientation. Obviously I'm not German. I moved to Germany. I moved to Berlin and in 2001, and then this point came 15 years later where my relationship with a German broke up. But I have these children that are German, so I was thinking, oh well, what, am I going to stay here? What is my relation to this city? And then the logical progression from that was, well, what is this city actually? From my perspective as an outsider, how can I understand this place? And Berlin is a very unusual and particular city in the enormity of its history is quite palpable on, in its cityscape, on the streets, in the buildings, but also in these weird in-between spaces. And I was just intrigued by that, and I knew that I could feel it, and just through conversations with other people that I knew, there was this sense that I was not alone in feeling this unusual kind of energy, and I think I just wanted to try and figure it out, try and see if I could put my finger on it and find a way to express it, you know, and to try and talk about something like the energy, the invisible energy of a city is, you know, it's a trap, you know, it's already esoteric, but I also felt like that was what I had to do.
And you do locate, in my opinion, you locate the source of this sort of stagnant energy of the city, this sensation of something not working, and its source is the water. And I'm going to use an obscene quantity of water metaphors tonight. I apologize in advance. It's so rich because you realize that water is just so symbolically potent. And I love the line in the prelude in the preface where you say, water always finds its way. We have so many different ways to speak about water in the book. The form of your writing sort of, it's like the tides, it ebbs and it flows. You are at this very watery period of your life where you've lost your bearings, you're out at sea, things are no longer fixed, things no longer keep their shape. And then you also arrive at water as this literal geographic feature of Berlin. Can you walk us through, for those who haven't read this book, the different sort of watery layers that you're unpeeling here, from the water of the city to the waters of your life?
I mean, it sounds like such an unbearable cliche, and I have to say, weirdly, as I was writing the book, it wasn't really in the front of my mind that there was so much water in it. I kind of didn't really realize that, but there was this fact of water damage in the house, of all of these bursts and ruptures and, you know, ongoing problems that just seemed weird. Plus the fact that the house itself is on the water, you know, on the canal. And then I had this other kind of moment of epiphany when a friend told me, oh, well, yeah, everyone knows that Berlin is built on sand, which I hadn't really quite figured that out, you know, and so I looked into that some more, and, you know, Berlin is built on a swamp, and actually the name of Berlin itself comes from the Slavic word for swamp, which is polu, or I can't really pronounce it, you know. So, and that just seemed to make a lot of sense to me, also with this kind of energy that I'd been trying to describe, of this sense of things sinking down, things being pulled down, and just the fact that the whole city was built on a swamp, which seems like like not the best place to build a city.
It's not a very good idea.
Exactly. You know, and that also with the fact that previously, before I lived in Berlin, I'd lived in New York, and New York is built on this bedrock, you know, and just that contrast seemed to make so much sense to me in terms of how those different cities function. You know, in New York, there's just this fast flow of, you know, clear water over a hard surface, like everything is moving very fast. There's just this current, and in Berlin, that just doesn't exist. There's no flow, there's no current, there's more this feeling of a kind of downward sensation, which makes it sound very negative, and I really, I'm not negative about it. It's more just a question of, you know, what is this actually?
I think this book, I can't recommend this book enough, and I'm sure everyone will buy it afterwards, you'll see what I mean, but it's so compelling to read. You're writing as an expat about this sort of foreign city that is so rich in this history that doesn't quite cohere, and there's an experience that one has when one moves to Paris that I think a lot of us have had that's analogous but maybe not quite the same, where you arrive you know, fresh in this city that's so soaked in history, and then you have this project of placing yourself in it and situating yourself in it. And Paris as well is a watery city. It's the boat that doesn't sink, and it's interesting when you read it, you think about the practices of walking through Paris that have emerged as well, the shared histories between Paris and Berlin writers who are trying to figure out what a city is, what it means to navigate a city. And I think that's something that's so rich about what you uncover about water. So you find out that Berlin is a swamp. You're living right next to this canal, the Landwehr Canal, which is kind of seen all these horrible, atrocious moments in history, which you uncover, and then you also sort of arrive at water as symbolic of the subconscious itself. It contains things that remain under the surface and that will inevitably bubble up as well. So can you talk about the sort of subconscious level of water in this book too, the almost psychoanalytic work you're doing of searching the bottom of things, seeing what you can drag up to the surface.
I mean, I know that that's in there, but that again wasn't really at the forefront of my mind when I was writing it. But the thing that was this question of where do the what happens to historical facts? What happens to these individual lives that are no longer in the city? All of these kind of minor traces that have been forgotten. Like where do they go? And I think the part of the reason I got interested in that was because I was reading these kind of books that came out in Germany around 2010 about inherited trauma and the kind of multi-generational inheritance of trauma, particularly of even the grandchildren of parents who'd experienced grandparents who'd experienced the bombings, for instance, in Berlin, or who'd lived in Berlin or in Germany during the Second World War. And that just seemed very fascinating to me, with this idea of memories or experiences that were not being spoken out loud. And where do they go? What happens to them? Where are they? And I think, because I was reading this literature at the same time as I was thinking about the cityscape, I was trying to imagine if you could transpose that onto the built landscape. These experiences that occur in a place, like where do their residues go? What happens to them? Do they disappear, or how can you feel them, and do they are they still resonant over time?
And you arrive again at the apartment, which contains space, contains these energies that have not disappeared but been transformed or transmogrified in strange and compelling ways. It's interesting, it seems like there are two levels of your project. On one level, you are performing a sort of excavation. It's archaeological. You're sifting the ground, finding the traces. There's also a project of superimposition where you're applying meaning to space. And I think this has an interesting relationship to cartography as a project of making a city legible, and your own project in this book of making your own life legible as it became this sort of unreadable thing to you. So in that spirit, I'm hoping you could talk a bit about the archival work you did to write this book, the sort of, when you all buy this book, as you will see that it's full of these delicious, delightful maps of Berlin and various dates of time, and you discover this history of urban planning and the invention of the city that is so rich and compelling. So how did you find these archives, and what did you discover there?
I mean, I'm a real archive junkie, I have to say. I love spending
You're in the right
time
place for that.
Cool. It had to do with this. The maps of Berlin are crazy because it's just changed so extremely. And that there's, I think, maybe 5 maps in the book, very kind of schematic reworkings of historical books, maps, and it's just really hard to place how it is now onto how it was before. And I kept trying to do that. This kind of, like you said, superimposition of the streetscape as it is now with how it was before the war, or how it was at the turn of the century. I mean, I think so. The archive, it's very literal in a way, because one of the first things I discovered when I started researching the canal itself is that it was designed and developed by the landscape architect Peter Joseph Lenné, who's also responsible for designing the Tiergarten, or redesigning the Tiergarten, and that the canal had been part of his great urban planning design to make Berlin as beautiful as Paris, basically.
Good luck.
Yeah. And then, and it was a beautiful, idealistic design. He came from landscape architecture, so landscape, trees, green areas played a very important role in it, and it developed around the 1840s, I think. So it was just as Berlin was becoming industrialized at this incredibly rapid pace, and he was seeing that the population was growing and that they would need respite, they would need green spaces and places to walk, and that's what the Landwehr Canal was. It has this beautiful tree-lined canal where people could promenade. But his design wasn't ever actually implemented because the way the city developed changed and the railways became more important, and so the only thing that actually remained of his design was this canal, you know. So I mean, I felt like this view of the things that I could see out of the window was just kind of leading me into the urban design history, you know. It was just all kind of there.
And it's so compelling. I was listening to an interview you did where you speak about urban planning and the sort of 19th century invention of the city as this project of seeing and imagining. It's an idealistic project. You project yourself into the future, project, play on words, and you sort of discover what life could be like for the future inhabitants. And in the case of Berlin, this very aspirational image of the future city sort of collides very abruptly with reality, the reality of the 20th century. So for those who haven't read this book, what Kirsty's doing here is she's tracing the history of Berlin sort of through the history of the building that you're living in. You uncover its original building and then its many inhabitants, the sort of different industries that pass through it, and then you bring us to the 20th century. What was it like for you to uncover such a known story from such a personal dimension, which is the space itself that housed it, the apartment that you're living in, that also witnessed this tragedy, this devastation, these continual attempts at rebuilding?
I mean, that was really thrilling on the one hand, to be able to find the original plans in the archives and all of this material, but it was also very moving, you know, because I did have this sense of the building that I live in as being a witness of all of these periods throughout history, you know, and very extreme things happened right on the door, you know, literally right on the doorstep. The house was built in 1869, you know, so it witnessed all of these different phases of Berlin's evolution. And I wanted to kind of get closer to that, you know, so that's when I started to see what I could find out about these previous inhabitants, and I really didn't have a lot to go on, just the names in the building register. But it was so, because I didn't have a lot to go on, you know, and I was trying to find some way of fleshing them out, I started reading literature from the period, you know, so that was my way of having these eyewitnesses, you know, to find out what it was like actually to walk around these streets during those times. And one of the main writers that I ended up kind of devouring was Theodor Fontana, who'd also lived exactly in that area, you know, and the daily walks that he was making was up and down the streets that I lived in myself. And so a lot of his characters and a lot of the narratives are actually taking place right in the same neighborhood. So I could kind of transpose the inhabitants, you know, particularly the female inhabitants. That's what I was really interested in because of my own, you know, experience as a female inhabitant, you know, so I was trying to think of how would it have been for the original wife that lived in this building when it was built in 1869, and, you know, so kind of did this again, like laying one map on top of another one, like to lay her identity over the identity, for instance, of Theodor Fontana's Cecile, who lived literally across the canal in a building that I would be able to see if it hadn't been bombed, you know. So yeah, so it was always this just trying to get to the detail, you know, trying to get to a sense of what that experience could have been like in whatever way, whether looking at urban design history or maps or literature or you know, artworks.
And you're an art critic. You're trained in looking, and you constantly in this book return to the practice of looking out the window and imagining what the sites used to look like from out the window, what they look like as now, as well as a sort of the symbol of the woman in the window. Can you talk a little bit more as the window about the window as a sort of source instrument of the practices of looking that you're employing in this book?
Yeah, source instrument is a really good way of putting it, actually. I realized that if I was going to attempt to write some kind of story that has to do with Berlin's history, which is it's a ridiculous, vast task.
It's an impossible
and subject
project,
matter.
yeah.
It's insane. That I would have to narrow it down, and really have quite a clear focus. So that's what the window frame became, that I would really just try and look at things that were within that area, So so just through the writing process, it would constantly, or the research, it would constantly widen out, and I'd just try and kind of snap it back into the frame as a way of just kind of training it, so that it didn't get out of hand, and so that I didn't lose myself in it any more than I was anyway losing myself in it. And then, there was this, because there's this kind of flipping between a kind of interiority and then the exterior of the city, and I was positioning myself at the window, looking out and analyzing what I could see through the window. Then I became this kind of like the traditional romantic Rückenfigur, a person painted from the back, looking out, so that the viewer of a painting that uses that device looks out with that figure, so it's this kind of shared subjectivity and shared perspective, and I think that was the thing that I was very conscious of, is that my perspective in telling this story was an explicitly subjective one, by definition.
And you said, if I can find it, you talk about the sort of explicitly subjective position in it, saying that it was important that you have something at stake in this place, that it's personal and subjective, but it's real. And as you're writing about this book, you said that you're beginning to plot your experiences onto these accumulated layers of time, words, and images. And so I think it's so compelling to think of the practice of the shared subjectivity, the shared perspective, in terms of in the same way that one thinks of the city as the shared space, the shared pathways we move through the city, it's also the shared ways we look at the city. We see the same things. And so for you, you're moving through Berlin, you're reading about Berlin, and then you're imposing your own experience onto Berlin. I want to return to what you said earlier about women, because I think gender is very interesting in this book. You had a particular attention to female experience in Berlin. You are a very voracious reader. You're reading the city, you're reading its street signs, you're reading the archives, but you're also reading books about Berlin. So you're reading Benjamin, you're reading Fontaine, but you're also reading female authors. And you sort of locate the space of the house, domestic space, as, I think, a female space. The woman's work is in the house. We've all heard that line before. It's unfortunate, but, and you say yourself, it's something that one does fall into. The woman does the housework. The woman, you talk about Wolf, the woman confined to her own room. So can you talk about the way that you wove gender into this story and the female figures that you encountered along the way?
I mean, I think that Berlin is like the narrative, the general, well-known narrative of Berlin is a very masculine narrative. It's militaristic, it's industrial, it's warmongering, it's destructive, it's totalitarian. It's like so super masculine and kind of monolithic. And I wanted to get away from all of those things, and I wanted to think about a more personal and a more individual view, and a kind of more kind of street level view, that was just more, domestic in scale, I suppose. And I don't think that the domestic is anymore necessarily female, thank goodness. But it is traditionally, and it certainly was in the 1870s or in the 1920s. But anyway, because I was, so I read Fontana, and I was looking at the drawings of Adolf Menzel, and, reading Benjamin, Franz Hessel, and all of these fantastic pieces of literature, but I did start to think, like, these are great, but where were the women? You know, who was writing about?
There.
Yeah, who was writing about the women in Fontana's stories from the women's perspective? You know, because Fontana is very sympathetic, but there's this kind of like sighing resignation, you know, at all of the terrible fates of his women, and there was something about that just made me feel a bit uncomfortable. So I started just, looking around, trying to see who were the women writing about the time, and and one of the things that happened is that I came across this incredible German writer who I hadn't heard of before, because there's a street near me named after her. The area on the other side of the canal where I lived was very badly bombed, and so it's this kind of it's all new build, there's lots of new streets, and a lot of these new streets in particular have been named after women. So this street was named after a woman called Gabriele Tergit, who I didn't know. I saw her name on this street sign, and I looked her up, and it was like a gift. It was like a blessing, because she was this incredible writer. In the meantime, her books have actually been reissued in English translation, or at least 2 of her novels, I believe. But at that time, they weren't. And she was writing in the kind of post-First World War period in the 1920s, and she was a journalist and wrote these incredible pieces of journalism about, everyday matters, about taking the bus and, the department stores, and also about what it was like to be a young woman after the First World War, and to kind of flesh out that, new woman experience, and also the generational misunderstanding that came with it, so that for me was just such a joy to discover her writing.
I just love all these women that you found, because you found all these little windows, right? Like you found these frames, these ways of seeing the world. And so insofar as the house bears witness to the city, you also find these little mini houses, which are the little people that move through it. And then the traces of them in the city streets as well. In Paris, we're seeing the same thing with the renaming of city streets after women, which is such a bearing to power and state power as well. We're rapidly running out of time, but we have 5 minutes left, and I'm just gonna keep pushing you on this. You read the city with such hunger. You read its signs. You read the literature about it. You also read a really compelling amount of theory about reading space, and you turn to unlikely sources who help you as you read the space of your own apartment. So you have someone who practices feng shui who comes and helps you sort of redirect the energy of your house. You briefly mention hydromancy, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. You consult an astrologist, and you attend something called the Family Constellation Seminar. Could you tell us a bit about these different approaches to reading space that you consulted in an attempt to understand your own apartment?
I mean, that's what they are for me, just ways to read. And I didn't really know anything about any of these practices beforehand, but I was just interested in what they might make available, particularly feng shui at the beginning, in this situation where I was trying to reconfigure my apartment and I didn't really know what to do. I thought, oh, well, feng shui, that's what you do in this situation, isn't it? You get, but I had really just thought it was to do with like turning your bed in that position and putting a mirror here, and that's this kind of superficial understanding of what the practice is. And then when this feng shui woman actually came into the house, she started talking about the past, and I was just really surprised about that. And but it was very interesting because it really chimed with my own experience in terms of like certain areas of the apartment that felt in a certain way. Anyway, so I started to look more into this, the practice of feng shui, and understood that it is just to do with observation. It's based in observation. It's there's nothing kind of weird about it. It's very rooted. So that was really interesting, and astrology and all of these things. It's not that I'm committed to them and lead my life towards them, but I do find it interesting because they are different ways of reading and mapping, mapping these situations. And then the final thing that I did, this family constellation, I actually the woman who was leading the family constellation is a writer, and I'd read her books that have to do with this intergenerational trauma and the possibility of finding a way to express it through this kind of therapy. So I thought it sounded interesting.
Could you briefly explain what the family constellation practice is? Because it's fascinating if people who aren't familiar with it.
Yeah, it's a kind of gestalt therapy where you have a group of participants in a room, and somebody, you'll have the leader, who is this woman, Gabriela, who's very experienced, and one person would describe to her the problem that they were having, and then she would organize this constellation by having different people, different members who were there in the room would stand in for different family members or different projects. So it's kind of a manifestation in space. And I mean, and then something happens. It's a kind of a patterning that happens through some subconscious. I can't find a useful way to describe it, actually. But
you're describing it excellently.
Thank you. But what happens is that you have this way of visualizing something that feels very internal, and that, to me, I'm not, again, not committed to it as a practice or anything, but I do find it really interesting, and I do, clearly it helps some people, and I think any way to kind of diagram an issue that's internal or invisible, like, I'm really interested in that. That seems really, really fascinating to me.
And I'm so glad you've said that, because that's also the practice of building a city, and that's the practice of writing. It's the placing things side by side, the positioning, and then kind of working your way out of that, finding the path, finding the way out. And as I was reading this book, the first sort of cliche one thinks of when one thinks about the house, stories of the house, is the haunted house, right? The house that holds phantoms. It struck me that writing this book was a form of exorcism. It was a way of getting the phantoms out of the house, to cleansing yourself of them. So, as my last question before we turn to our audience, and before if you're happy to ask you to read slightly a bit more, I'd like to know how writing this book changed the way you position yourself in relation to this house, changed the way you move through it, the way you relate to it.
I mean, it did change a lot, actually. I mean, the water damage stopped. Didn't have any more leaks.
Unbelievable.
And I didn't feel, I felt like I got it out of my system. I didn't feel so obsessed with, I wasn't its puppet anymore. I mean, it did feel like it was a haunting, because the spirit of the house was really in me, because I'd let it in. I'd invited it in and kind of gone on this journey with it to find out everything I could about it, which was really, really, really fascinating and totally unsustainable as a long-term process. So by the time I got to the end, it's that process of just revealing things, I mean, one of the other things I talk about in the book is shame, and, the root of shame is that things are hidden, and if they're revealed, then the shame disappears.
It's free, so it's liberated.
Exactly, and so that, it was part of that process of just talking about things that happened, and that felt very, freeing and cathartic, and now we just live there, and it's fine.
I'd like to ask you to read a last passage that I've marked out, because I think the reason we were so excited to host you tonight, as I said at the beginning of this event, is that this is an expat community in Paris. We're all sort of trying to position ourselves in this historic space of the city, which is both ours but isn't ours, and we're outsiders but we're not. We make it ours. And what you've really done with this book, as you said earlier, that you were taking maps and placing them on top of one another, you've placed your own map on top of all the others, and you've made yourself part of the history of Berlin as well. And you've assumed the responsibility that accompanies that, which is a really great responsibility. So there's just a brief paragraph that I'd like you to read, and then we'll turn it to our lovely patient audience.
Just put my glasses on. This one.
Yeah.
The deeper I get into the fabric of this place, this view, the less I'm sure about my relation to it. Why is it I am here again? And who am I to tell this story? My view exposes an inherent dilemma of history and raises the question of where responsibilities lie. Do I have a responsibility to this past? A past that belongs to the house in which I happen to choose to live? Can such a sense of responsibility traverse eras and knit us together in the present, in a self-made community of remembrance? Is this, in fact, the shared responsibility that comes with the territory of Berlin, to look and then look again?